seeing as it was running and how you all were interacting with it. So generally for junior ROTC, when I do Jeopardy, we break into two teams. It's a forced participation, you know, because there is that speaking portion requirement in junior ROTC. And here, when I try to do it in that kind of format, I usually get 2 or 3 people that come up all the time, and everybody else just kind of bags it in and stays at their desk, right? So what I've kind of started doing was, if you want to run individual numbers on like how you do, and I just kind of run through the review, that's how I've been running it. Do you want to try to run it as a game, or do you want me just to kind of lead it and you follow along? That's indicative of how you want to play this. So I will lead it, okay, and we'll go from there. So again, you can have the study guide out, you can have the origins of our rights, you can have the philosopher's analysis. In fact, probably pretty good to have your study guide out, even if you don't have it done, because guess what? Do you think the answers are going to come up? Yes. But honestly, they're not going to come up, which is one of the reasons why I do like this Jeopardy. So we have to actually talk about the answers to get to the answers. So it seems like today, the previous 2 classes wanted to work across from the 1,000, work their way back up to 200. I'm wondering if it might be better just to go straight down by a category. Do you have a preference? Straight down?
I just say random.
Okay.
Like
Random?
the TV show does.
So the random's going to drive you nuts, because I usually put little marks in each one of the boxes so I know which ones we cover, and then after a while it looks like the screen's got smallpox or chicken pox. So let's try it this way. So what is the rule of law?
Nobody can break the law, and everybody's required to follow the law. Nobody's above the law, and even the government has to follow the law.
No one is above the law. Now, this is an important one for us to remember, right? Because there's probably adults in our country right now that don't understand the rule of law, right? Or, I just read an article, an op-ed from one person that basically was misconstruing certain actions that are being taken under rule of law, but was misconstruing them as not being legally under the rule of law, right? So, you know, it's an important notion, but it all comes back down to what? Will they be treated fairly under the law and go through the same legal process that we would go through in that incident, right? And so, you know, that's a really important point, especially in our country right now, you know, when we're weighing such a hyper-partisan period, is this, right? No one is above the law. It's interesting watching politicians, because in many ways they all figure they're what? Above the law, right? So that's a good answer for what is the rule of law. All right, for 400, what do laws do?
Limit the power of the government and government citizens' rights and protection.
Right, and then we'll just put these 2 things, right? Because if you can remember that, 1, 2, right? Because you remember what I said. Most of the laws in our country, you feel like they're against you, right? I have to stop at the stop sign. Oh, I can't go past 35 miles per hour, right? But the laws in our country, most of them actually are self-limiting on our government so that they don't take advantage of us, right? Or just to make the function of the government work best. Like, what is today? What's special about today? Well, so what was special about last year on this date? The inauguration, right? And so mandated by the 20th Amendment is that every 20 January when we have a new election, that following January we have an inauguration of the president. Now, you know, if they're re-elected, they don't usually go through the whole, you know, ceremony and everything else, but that is something that's mandated in law, right? So that we don't have what? One party deciding that, you know, the changing of president can happen at any time, right? So what's the concept of limited government?
Powers of the government are restricted.
Right, so they're restricted And what else? When we say limited government, we're usually talking about a specific kind of flavor to that government. Be it a unitary, be it a confederal, be it a federal, right? Those systems, then even in those, you could have a limited government. A limited government really implies not only that restricted on what they can take in actions towards the country, but also that they understand where does their power come from. If it's a limited government, where does power come from? It probably doesn't come from the government, right? Because
No.
it's limited, right? So it comes from, they're restricted, that's what we said. I'm taking it one more step further, right? The power comes from the people. Okay? Or something, right? If we use the example of America, we would say what? It's a limited government, the power comes from the people, or lobbying groups, right? But if it was Iran, we would say Iran has a limited government, right? And you all are scratching your head going, really? I thought they could do this and this and this. Well, guess what? Their power in the government comes from who?
The people.
From Islam, right? From religion, from that theocracy. And so it's important to note that all of their court cases really go through an Islamic court. So that's telling in terms of exactly the limitations on the government, right? So everything has to have a second approval from religion for doing that, okay? So what's habeas corpus? Unlawful imprisonment, right? Protects against it. Anybody remember what the Latin means? No? Having the body. Okay. I'm looking around for some of you, right? You notice I write this, right? And you could say I'm writing it for you, but I know I'm doing it with my chicken scratch and I'm shortening, so I'm really doing it for who? This guy, right? And it's getting buried more and more into my mind, right? So those of you just kind of, staring at nothing, you're probably not making the best use of this time, okay? So figure it out. There's paper in the box, there's probably more study guides, there's the other practical exercises and all that. So what happens when habeas corpus is suspended?
People will be put in jail for no reason.
Right. So when does it usually get suspended? Martial law is usually the biggest one, right? Say in the case of Lincoln, he had to do it very early on in the Civil War because you were having riots at draft centers, and they started suspecting that it was Southern sympathizers that were agitating the crowd. And so, but they couldn't be absolutely sure, so what would they do? They would take those suspected ones, throw them in jail, and then do the background to try to figure it out, okay? It's still not a shining moment for Lincoln in any kind of regards, right? It probably confirms what? Some of the fears that Southerners had about Lincoln, but he doesn't really have a choice right there, right? You get into a war, sometimes you don't get to set the conditions for how you're going to actually prosecute the war, right? Other instances, Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, bless you. Because of the conditions and the dangers with the hurricane, the flooding levees and all of that, but you also had some looting, right? So they declared martial law. Martial law will sometimes allow federal troops, so U.S. Army to actually move around. But in those instances, if you saw pictures of like the 82nd Airborne flying around in helicopters with their rifles, they didn't actually have any ammunition. It was just all for show, right? So because the U.S. Army is a little leery about this type of, thing, right? We don't consider that to be our job. So just keep that in mind. All right, so what's due process?
The government must follow procedures and trials.
Right, so procedure and trial must be followed, right? So if you've got rule of law, the expectation is with rule of law that it's going to go through due process, right? Now, of course, the sticky point is what? The media will sensationalize and maybe the person doesn't feel like they're getting a fair shake, right? But in terms of the rule of law going through the court system, that's due process. So let's talk an example that might affect you, right? So let's say that it's after midnight in Columbia County, right? What happens in Columbia County after midnight if you're under the age of 18? Curfew, right? So you get stopped by the deputy, right? And then the deputy's like, hey, what you doing? And you're like, I'm heading home, right? If you're nice about it, the deputy will probably just send you off with a warning, right? Of course, there may be some baggage from them stopping multiple teams that were doing the same thing, so they might be a little angry by that point in time. If you agitate them, they might actually follow you home to make sure that you're going home, right? So be careful of lying, because that can also get you in trouble, right? No parent ever wants to deal with the sheriff's office at, 15 minutes after midnight. It usually puts us in a bad mood, right? But the deputy, when he's talking to you, realizes and smells either some alcohol or some wacky tobacco. You guys know what wacky tobacco is?
Tobacco.
Marijuana, right? A little bit of MJ, right? Can smell it, and you're sitting there realizing that the deputy is really kind of breathing it in, and you're like, oh man, right? So the deputy goes, clearly you're not going to continue driving home, so we're going to take you to the detention center, and you're going to get to spend the night, okay? So before you get in that vehicle, what does the officer have to do? One has to have probable cause, right? But the officer needs to do what?
Read you your rights.
Read your rights, right? So the Miranda rights, which start off with what? You have the right to
Remain silent.
remain silent. Anything that you say
Will be said against you in court.
and it will be used against you in court of law, right? Do you understand your rights? And you go, yes. Oh my gosh, my parents are going to kill me, right? So then you go down to the detention center. What are you expecting as soon as you get to the detention center? You've seen it in the movies, right? What do you expect as one of your rights in due process? One phone call, right? You're like, who am I going to call, right? Be wise about it. Don't call your buddy because they probably don't have the money for bail, right? But inside the next 24 hours, you're supposed to get in front of a judge so that they can set a bail amount so that you can be let loose until the actual court trial. You're supposed to have the charges read against you so you know what you're facing. And then you should be offered a court-appointed attorney if you don't have the money for it, right? For a drug, alcohol charge, and you were driving, you probably want a court-appointed attorney if you really can't afford one, right? So, and then it goes to the next step, right? Eventually, you have to actually plead something, and then they go into the actual trial. It'll either be a trial where the judge sits on top of it, or it'll be a jury trial. And then once the verdict is read, right? Then you can either move to an appeal or you go to jail. Either way, if you're found guilty, you can go into jail and then you can run the appeal from jail, right? So that's due process in our country. Fair?
Yes.
Okay. Where it's probably not fair is that some of those criminal proceedings aren't always equal in the eyes of everybody, right? Sometimes the rich are not going to the prisons that the poor and the middle class go to, right? They go to swanky digs and not really experience true prison. All right, so what's a unitary government?
Powers are held by one.
By one something, right? So when we draw this, okay, nation state, so all the power goes where? From nation to states, right? So this is not always bad. It tends to drift towards being bad, right? But you can have a benevolent unitary government, right? That generally sees their job as being more in the framework of Locke, right? Where the government's position is to protect the people, those types of things. But there is the case that it could drift into being something really bad. So what's an oligarchy, which would be a bad version of that?
The power goes to one person.
No, in an oligarchy, it goes to a small group of elites, right? I know Tom, you had it right there, right? So that small group of elites might be best friends, they might be relatives. Cuba is a good oligarchy in terms of that, right? The Castro family, basically in all of the cabinet positions, and from there, the president and the vice president were both Castros. What about the Russian model? It's considered an oligarchy, but you don't exactly have like elites in terms of intellectuals. So what do we usually label as kind of their type of oligarchy? You remember that? What do you call someone that's a constant thief? They can't stop themselves. A kleptomaniac, right? And so Russia is an oligarchy, but they're really a kleptocracy, right? Where they do have that ruling elite, but because basically they're stealing the money of the Russians, right, and putting it into their own industries, right, and then giving it to Putin and keeping their positions, that's the reason why they're an oligarchy, but they're more accurately a kleptocracy, or a kleptarchic, whatever. Not germane to this conversation. So what type of government is a dictatorship referred to as?
Authoritarian.
Authoritarian, right. The big egg, right? Generally, authoritarian governments aren't usually very benevolent. I guess you could have one conceivably, but generally, when power really is held in one individual, generally, the only way that individual can kind of control everything is by harsh means. So what's a confederal government?
An alliance of independent states.
All right, so we get kind of our puzzle pieces, right? So where does power come from, Thomas? From the states, right? So the states give the power. What would be the two reasons why states would be willing to give up some power to a national one? Trade would be one, good. Do we have an example? The EU, right. So, and then what's the other one? Protection, defense. Mutual defense is usually the phrase that we use. This morning, your counterparts kept going, NATO. And I'm like, NATO is not a government entity. NATO is an alliance, right? So like, NAFTA was a trade alliance, right? NATO is a military alliance. Maybe you could say during the occupation of Afghanistan when there was no government and NATO was there, that NATO was kind of filling in as that confederal. But funny I mentioned Afghanistan. Throughout most of the history of Afghanistan, the people of Afghanistan don't think of themselves as Afghans. It's been probably the hardest point of trying to make them successful in the modern world is get them thinking of themselves as Afghans. They generally view themselves as tribal, right? And so what that means is that often they have actually come together under a confederal system with the tribes to protect themselves from, people like Genghis Khan and those kinds of invasions, right? So, but probably the best example, and the example that we're going to go over in the next unit, is the U.S., our early years, 75 to 91, the Articles of Confederation. Okay? And that was our original agreement amongst the colonies for mutual defense to defeat the British. So that's where they came under, right? There was still lots of trade arguments going on, and there wasn't really a way to settle it. But we're going to talk about what those issues were in the next unit. All right, what's a parliamentary system of government?
Executive and legislative branch are one.
Right. And then I like doing this, right? Okay? The prime minister and the cabinet all come from the legislative branch, right? So who elects the prime minister? The legislative branch, right? This is why when you usually in some European countries where you've got 20 or more parties, you have to get like 5 to 8 parties onto the same ticket to be able to secure your person as the prime minister. It is a little wonky though, because I do still wonder what you do when those people are doing those primary jobs and they were elected. It's still something I need to go back in and look at. Okay. All right. So what's a direct democracy?
the will of the people is translated into public.
We the people, right? The power of the vote is with us. Now, today, with as large as our country is and everything else, usually the only places that you really see that direct democracy is more so in the form of maybe like with the churches, maybe really small towns, but churches, thinking the church council handles kind of the daily business, but they always do voters meetings, monthly or quarterly or semi-annually. So, but that direct democracy, you see it written, right? Article this morning was talking about with the filibuster and the voting rights legislation that was up with the Senate last night, right? And the way that the author started the article was talking that you had 48 senators representing Democrats that represent 48 million more people than the Republicans that have 50 senators, right? And so it was trying to kind of make that argument. But when they start with those kinds of numbers, whether it's right or wrong, right? When you start with individual voters, you're signaling what?
Direct democracy.
Direct democracy, right? So what's a representative democracy on the flip side? Lots of spelling problems. Okay, so they select or elect representatives that are supposed to act in it for us, right? The problem is what? You and I and our individual votes are competing against lobbying groups that are giving them millions of dollars, right? And so, in most elections, most normal people don't give more than $100 to a campaign, right? That's just a drop in the bucket. You'll see later on in one of our units, it takes millions and millions and hundreds of millions of dollars to be able to run for president. Okay. Now, parties won't even look at you unless you've got $1 million in the bank as a candidate, right? So, what's a federal government?
Powers divided among national states.
So, how does that look? Where are the arrows going?
Up and down.
Up and down. Okay. And I think it's unit 3. We'll talk layer cake, right? So, but when I'm introducing this idea, so that every time you hear federalism or federal, you think layer cake in that regard. Okay. All right, so what's a presidential system of government? All right, and who elects executive and legislative?
The people.
The people, right?
We the people elect officials.
Right? We elect them, right? That's the reason why we kind of expect our president to be what? To go beyond just their party, right? That we expect them to kind of put their arms around everybody. It's just, it's been one of the expectations. It doesn't mean that the presidents in our history have always done that, right? There's certain times where presidents feel like they've got to actually take a position on it rather than try to balance the two. So what is the form of government established by the United States Constitution? I know it says answer must be exact, but I'm going to give you a couple of options on words and phrases. So what kind of words would you use to describe our government? We just whatever one, right? So what was that? Federalism? Okay. What would be another one that you would use? A democracy? Right. Oh, limited democracy. No? Oh, presidential. Okay. Wow. Man, I'm having lots of spelling issues right now. Okay? End of the day.
Confederalism.
Nope. Federalism. Federalism. Can't have those wacky states taking too much power, right?
Yeah.
Right.
My goodness.
Although in your lifetime we might actually be a confederalism.
What about when we choose leaders to vote for us? What's that called? Starts with an R.
We've answered this one.
Representative.
Yeah, representative.
And also there's another R word that is part of the name of one of our political parties that is that type of government too. Republic.
Right. So, Thomas Jefferson described our government as a democratic republic. Okay.
So democratic means the citizens get to vote on something. In the case of a democratic republic, we get to vote on our leaders. And our leaders get to vote on the laws. So a republic is making sure we have leaders that get to vote on the laws. We don't all have to go file in to Congress, all of us, all 5 million, or however many million we have in the US, to go vote on every law. We get to elect leaders to vote for it. That makes it a republic.
There's also, by calling it republic, there's a that puts the pressure on each one of us as citizens, right? It makes it a loaded comment instead of, oh, I'm just a citizen of the United States, right? It places the onus of the quality of our government on us, the voters. All right, which philosophers influenced the Declaration of Independence?
Montesquieu.
All right, so I've got Montesquieu.
Hobbes.
All right, I've got Locke, and I've got Hobbes, and I've got, who's the other French one?
It's not too long.
Rousseau.
So,
Right? Okay, so I agree. Those are the philosophers.
yep.
Generally, most of the framers of the Constitution had read them, or if they hadn't, they acted like they did. Right? Because otherwise, you didn't really get much of a say. So, so what did Magna Carta do?
Establish the power of the monarchy.
Power of, here, let's do something fun. Not absolute. Right? Like my crown? Pretty good, right? Andrew, I have to warn you, my drawings are not really good, right? My painting is only good when I use my fingers. Okay. In the lab, I can get texture, right? And it's stress reliever, right? So, what else about Magna Carta? What were the nobles arguing for? Or what were they arguing against? Was there something about taxes in there? Maybe it was about kind of excessive fines and bail, right? Maybe. At least for them, right? But probably the biggest one was what? Did anybody trust King John?
No.
No. So if you don't trust the king in making those judgments, you would of course want all your buddies to help you, right? Because otherwise, if you're in a court case and the king hates you in that moment, it could go really bad for you, right? And so by having the jury of your peers, maybe at least you'll get a fair shake, right? They at least understand what you're going through and have some kind of idea about it, okay? Is that pretty good for Magna Carta, or is there anything else we want to add to it? Well, remember what we said. By bringing Magna Carta to the king, they are in effect doing what?
Rebelling against him.
Well, they're rebelling, so Locke would enjoy that one. But they're able to do a petition, right? And so this gets back to this not absolute by them petitioning. Now, they're not asking for the right to petition. They just kind of asserted that right, okay? So, what did the Petition of Right express?
Monarchs were expected to obey the law of the land.
Okay. Monarch, respect law of the land. I find it easier on trying to remember on this one, at least one thing about it, is what was the impetus for doing the Petition of Right? What allowed for Parliament to have a little bit of power to be able to force this on to the king? Remember what it was? Taxes, right? The king wanted more taxes for being able to wage war, right? And so Parliament goes, we'll give you your taxes, but we want you to sign the Petition of Rights, right? And so, in this way, the power to tax becomes, who does it? Parliament, right? The legislative branch, right? So when we say, which branch controls the money, it's who? The legislative branch, right? The executive branch uses the money, but the legislative branch is the one that can actually determine the amount of money that's available and whatnot, right? What else does the Petition of Right protect? Was there something that we saw in our Fifth Amendment? Maybe something with due process? No? Maybe something with an jury? No? You guys got your Origins of Our Rights doctrine? Is there anything else there that you have? Or on your study guide? No? So this would probably be a good moment to go back in, make a note, and say, okay, I need to go back, look at the lesson slides, maybe do a thinking map off of the Petition of Rights so I can name 3 things that the Petition of Rights protected. And that would probably help you, at least visually, in trying to remember how to distinguish the Petition of Rights, say, from the English Bill of Rights. So what were some of the rules of the English Bill of Rights? So this one I like to remember, since it says Bill of Rights, there's probably some that are directly in our Bill of Rights, right? Check someone's got.
I have big arms.
Right, so which one is that one?
Right to petition the king.
The right to petition, right? So if you go through our amendments, then you could probably match it up, right? So the right to petition from our First Amendment. What about our Second Amendment?
Right bear arms.
The right to, we're going to say what the English say, keep arms, right? You have to remember, this is still a time where you could have the French or the Spanish actually try to attack and land in England, right? So there's a realization that, if we give it to them, they'll be able to locally defend themselves. There's still problems with the Irish. There's still problems with the Scots. So it just makes sense. Plus, nobility's kind of changing. Instead of these large castles where they can have these large armories and they're purposely keeping the weapons out of the peasants' hands, right? They've kind of modified it. So what else?
No cruel punishment.
No cruel punishment? No excessive fines, again, right? What else? Was there something about the Third Amendment? What's our Third Amendment? No quartering of troops, right? So this one is stated in this one because all of England's getting tired of that. Okay. That's probably pretty good, right? Do you agree? Again, if you sit down and just do a hub and spoke thinking map, you probably could write out a bunch of them. That's probably pretty easy to go through the slides. You probably have that done in at least 10 minutes. So what's the term for the hypothetical agreement between citizen and government, whereby the individual exchanges freedoms for protection? What is that? Hobbes uses the phrase. Locke really jumps on trying to explain what the phrase is. Rousseau also goes back and uses it. Montesquieu uses it too, right?
What's the
social
Okay.
contrast.
Contract. Good. We'll work on this together and we'll figure it out, right? Social contract theory. Okay. So that's what that term, that phrase is. All right. So how did Thomas Hobbes influence our concept of government? So what was his initial argument?
Consent of the governed.
Yes. Consent of governed. The exchange, right? Social contract. Government responsible for safety, right? For protection. We good with that one? Okay. I'm happy with this. As long as you can remember that with Hobbes, you're getting in the right direction. It does get a little bit hard to differentiate though, right? So you have to make sure that you pick up on how to exactly differentiate between Locke and... Because what Locke does is he basically takes Hobbes' ideas and he goes, I concur, let me take it another step further, right? And so Locke argues what? Power of the is not absolute, right? Reinforces government should protect. And then what else does he say? Yes, the right to revolt if king fails. And then what does that mean? Well, if you had a revolution, you can do what? Install a new government. These are pretty radical ideas at this time, but again, remember what I said, it's a special moment. Yes, ma'am. But you can see why the framers of the Constitution might have really latched on to Locke, because you just did what? You revolted, right? And you're in the process of installing a new government. So you can see just conceptually, they're going to drift more towards Locke as that philosophical underpinnings for the Constitution in terms of just the rationale for why we did it. Okay. So how does Rousseau influence?
Freedom of religion.
Freedom of religion, right? Pretty easy. Now, look, it's a whole lot more complicated just because there were arguments between people that thought we should use the more Locke model versus the Rousseau model. But for the purposes of our course, the focus is on just Rousseau's contribution to the freedom of religion. We talked about the Pledge of Allegiance, right?
Yeah.
Right? So, there's all sorts of little things in our country that maybe kind of that line between separation of church and state just gets kind of blurred. Again, most of the framers of the Constitution were very religious, so it may strike you weird that they actually saw still that dividing line had to be there. But again, they grew up with what? Europe was a very religious, almost theocracies in that kind of way. And think about it, most of the heavy hitters in the framing of the Constitution, they can count back to their ancestors trying to escape religious persecution in England, right? So it just makes sense that they're wanting to protect your ability to go have your religion, not have a state-mandated one. So what were John Locke's ideas on government? Did I just do that one?
No.
Oh, okay.
They should make a representative government.
Okay, so representative. Okay. Anything else? That's probably the big one right there, right? What was Montesquieu's? Remember what I said. What's the way to remember Montesquieu? three. Yep, 3 branches with the ability to check and balance each other and to have separate powers. You have to remember, this time that these guys are writing these are thought problems that they're working through. Yeah, you might have some kind of insider information about how it's working in the colonies, but they're really trying to extrapolate what would be that best form of democracy. And so Montesquieu's underpinnings right there really influenced Madison, Jefferson to a good degree, but Madison especially. All right, so your final Jeopardy. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Okay, so what's going on in this statement? Well, one, by the time we get to the 14th Amendment, this phrase men has been replaced, right? By the time we get to the 15th Amendment, it's really replaced, right? And by the time we get to the 19th Amendment, it's replaced. You guys picking up on what I'm dropping, right? So the 14th Amendment reinforces that the Bill of Rights is basically for everybody, no matter their color, skin, race, ethnicity, gender, and now we've taken it to sexual orientation, right? And the 15th Amendment gives manhood suffrage, right? So a man that doesn't own property can now vote, right? That's also supposed to encourage African American men to be able to vote. The 19th Amendment gives the right to women. Pretty cool, right? 26th Amendment, though, kind of curtails it because it basically puts the voting age at 18. So it is what it is. Okay? Now, what are these unalienable rights? What's the other term we use for unalienable rights? Natural rights, right? So if you had to paraphrase that, you would put it with natural rights. All right. Yay, you're a winner.